Hello, and welcome to another episode of Trust and Trade, a podcast produced by the Antitrust Law Section of the American Bar Association. Trust and Trade is a podcast for seasoned practitioners interested in deep dives into the areas of competition, consumer protection, and privacy law, and casual listeners interested in hearing more about some of the deals that we talk about or new technologies that we discuss. Each episode is presented by one of the specialty committees within the section. This episode is produced and co-hosted by the Media and Technology Committee of the Antitrust Law Section. Today's episode is on protecting app-level competition in artificial intelligence, or AI. I had a whole intro for this episode that I've pretty much chucked into the trash after DeepSeek's AI chatbot entered the US market shortly before this episode was recorded. This episode is about app-level competition in AI, and it's useful to think of AI apps as the top of a pyramid of different component layers, each of which is necessary for you to be able to open an app on your phone and create an AI-generated image or ask for something from an AI query box. At the bottom layer of this pyramid, you have the chips, operating systems, and cloud computing that power AI. Then you have the model layer, where companies like OpenAI, Anthropic, and Meta, among others, create foundation models that are the brains coming up with the answers for the AI apps that we use. Then you have a services layer, and then sitting at the tippy top of that pyramid, you come to the part that you and I as users interact with, the app layer. Almost immediately after ChatGPT was introduced to the public in the fall of 2022, competition authorities have been laser focused on the AI space. Their cause of concern has been a handful of dominant players at key points in the AI stack. The AI chip market has been dominated by NVIDIA's GPUs, which, depending upon how you slice it, account for 70 to 95% of the market. Amazon, Microsoft, and Google account for more than 60% of the cloud computing market. And the concern that enforcers had was that legacy tech companies may extend their influence into this space, entrenching themselves before some of these upstart AI rivals had a chance to upend their markets. So enforcers began carefully scrutinizing deals and investments between companies at different layers in this stack. Antitrust enforcers launched a series of investigations into exclusive contracting, acquisitions, investments, overlapping directors. In the US, the Department of Justice opened an investigation into NVIDIA, and the Federal Trade Commission opened an investigation into Microsoft and OpenAI. And underlying all of this was a premise by competition enforcers that there was only really one way to create AI, involving spending an enormous amount of money into different layers of the stack that we've been talking about. Then in January of this year, DeepSeek, a Chinese-owned artificial intelligence company, introduced an AI chatbot that may completely change how we think about competition in these markets. If their own hero's journey tale is true, and there have been some questions raised about the truthfulness of exactly how they developed their model, but take it as true for now, DeepSeek developed a foundation model nearly as good as its rivals using a lot less money and a lot fewer chips. So is competition at the app level in AI in danger? Or has the emergence of DeepSeek completely upended the investment model and broken down the barriers to entry for developers? I've invited a panel of experts onto the show today to discuss this very topical issue. Joining me today, we have Scott Weiner. Scott is the AI lead and Fractional CTO. Scott, I love the idea of a Fractional Chief Technology Officer. In my mind, there's a slice of you that is at NeuEon. Scott is the Fractional CTO of NeuEon with more than 30 years of experience growing software companies. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you.
We also have Elyse Dorsey. Elyse is an antitrust partner at the law firm Kirkland and Ellis LLP, with prior experience at both the Department of Justice's Antitrust Division and the U.S. Federal Trade Commission. Welcome, Elyse.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
To both of you, how does DeepSeek change your thinking about competition at the AI app level?
So I heard about DeepSeek pretty much the day it was released, which was about a week before the R1, before it really kind of hit the news. And so I started playing with it, and I didn't see it being that much better than what I had experienced with other models. I didn't understand yet some of the claims, like some of the things you just mentioned in terms of how much less expensive it was and all of that. So it was just another model I was trying out. I try out different models almost every day, honestly. So I try a lot of different models. And then the news hit and everyone freaked out. And what they were freaking out over was, as you said, there was a premise that it's very expensive to build these foundational models. And all of a sudden this new one, this upstart just appeared out of nowhere for a lot less money and a lot less power and so on. It doesn't look like that's really what it is. And so some of the shine came off of it pretty quick, that it's not really built the way they said. Yet, it still makes the point that these things are going to continue to get cheaper, more accessible, use less power. Overall, I think just a good indication that the market is going to continue to move towards faster and cheaper, meaning that it's going to open up to more people. More of us are going to have access to these models and can do more for less. For app developers, it's a wonderful thing to know that that's going to happen. Now, there's another point to this, though, and is that one of their claims is it's an open source model, meaning anyone can see it and touch it and do what they want with it. And that's not completely true. And that was part of the issue, is the weights, the way the model is defined is open source, meaning that I can go download it and run it on my own computer if I have the power to do it. And I do. But I don't get the source code that they use for training the model. I don't get their training data. So I don't really know how they train the model. And this leads to some of the other problems that they found with the model. And so because there are other problems, we can go into those if you want, but I don't feel like it's earth-shattering and game-changing, but I do feel it tells us where the market is going. We're going to have models that are going to be faster and more effective. There's no way that all the other foundation models aren't learning from this and going to make their models even better. It's just going to keep happening. So it's an exciting time if you're into AI to see how fast this stuff's progressing. It's very hard to keep up with.
All right. Well, Scott, I will definitely agree with that last part, that there is a lot to try and keep up with. And it's been a very exciting couple weeks. As a competition attorney, I think both the points you hit on are super interesting and potentially harbingers of things to come. So on the cost side, in terms of just what it takes to build some of these systems, I think that has been part of why the agencies have been so laser focused, as Anant put it, on some of these issues in AI, right? It is potentially revolutionary, and a lot of super interesting and innovative things can come out of it. But we tend to get the most innovation when there's actually competition. And if, it's too expensive to get in and, there's only a couple of people controlling it, that, often raises some competition concerns from that perspective. Mm-hmm. So super interesting. Again, even if the cost reductions aren't quite as large as they were initially stated to be, I think it's super interesting that there might be some big changes in terms of costs on the horizon. And then the open source point, I think, is, again, from a competition perspective, really interesting, because I think the thought has been so far, right, that might not be a viable option here. And again, there's different ways to define open source. It can kind of be on a sliding scale. It doesn't mean absolutely everything is open to everyone. But it could be a way of, bringing some new materials and information to people in a different way that is, again, kind of exciting and breaking off potentially a little bit from what we've seen so far in the industry. Is just like another business model, another avenue to try, which again, I think is always good for competition. So yeah, a lot of exciting stuff going on.
Yeah.
Scott, how hard is it to make a successful AI app right now?
I would start with how hard is it to make a successful app, period. It's difficult. There's a lot of saturation in the marketplace. So from that perspective, it's difficult. On the other hand, the actual act of building an app right now is getting easier and easier. The tools are getting better. You can do things with a lower level of skill that you couldn't do before in terms of just constructing an app and a process. However, what we're finding is, and a lot of the companies we work with, is there's a couple of problems that are barriers right now. One is having a skill development team. There is a skill set you need to use AI effectively, and there's not enough of people that have that training and expertise. So that's one issue. The other is that within the research and development, there's still the reality that as exciting as AI is, and it opens up all these opportunities to do things we couldn't do before. All of a sudden I can write software that easily looks at images and sound and text and processes and categorizes. It's very exciting to be able to do that easily and not have it be a really math intensive thing to deal with. But it creates this shiny object problem for companies. They're not as focused sometimes on what the real pain points are for their customers, and they're building things just for the sake of it. I think that's going to get better over the next few years. In other words, there was such an excitement around AI. Everyone just kind of bolted AI into everything they did. Now they're starting to go back to the fundamentals of, what are the pain points we need to address, and how do we differentiate from our competitors, and so on. And that's why I think you're seeing a lot more verticalization in AI. The apps that are coming out, they tend to be much more focused on an area. Another problem that we're running into is data acquisition and processing of the data. I don't think people really appreciate how difficult it is to get high quality data, which is fundamental to doing good AI. In other words, garbage in, garbage out. If you give me data that's not high quality, then my output won't be high quality. An example of that would be if you give me resumes that are all male, I'm going to tend to choose people that have male resumes, and I'm going to leave out females from jobs. This is not good for recruiting systems. So when you think about it, the biases that get built into these systems is just one example of where if I don't have a good quality data coming in to train these AIs, I'm not going to get good results either. And so that's a very difficult part of all of this. And then we get into what we're really going to talk about more today, which is the technology stack and the infrastructure. And all of a sudden, thinking about those different layers, as you described it, of the stack, what I find very difficult today is that from an app developer perspective is when I want to say, I'm going to build an application and I'm going to use AI within the application, I have some decisions to make. One of them is which model am I going to use? What infrastructure am I going to use? And they're not apples to apples right now, meaning that the way you would measure the value and the cost of using one model over another is not equivalent. It's not like if you went to buy a car and it had a price and the price was based on a fixed feature set where you can say, oh, how much horsepower does this have? How much horsepower does this have? There's different metrics for how these things are measured and how they're costed. And so creating ROI calculators is more complicated when looking at the benefits of working in one aspect or another. So if I'm a startup, I'm building a new application, I could use a model like DeepSeek, where I could actually, because it's open source, I could run it on my own machine and get myself up and running really fast. But what does it really cost to host that? And as I scale, how well is it going to scale? And there's a lot of other factors that go into why you might work with one of these larger foundation companies because they have all that infrastructure in place, and that adds value. So if I want to get up and running fast, I need to work with a larger organization because they've got all the pieces already in place. But then if I look at the long-term viability of that from a cost perspective, I may make other choices. So there's a lot of choices that go into this. And finally, there's the 70% problem we run into, which is that AI is attractive because it solves a lot of the surface level problems that you have of building an application. But that last 30% is still block and tackling, hard stuff, foundational fundamentals that you have to be able to do. You need good security, you need good data governance, you need good infrastructure. You need to be able to monitor your AI to make sure that it's working correctly. Something that people don't really recognize about AI that don't work with it every day is that AI is not static, meaning if I train a model and then start using it, over time that model can and often will degrade. The quality of it, as the data is changing that I'm working with, the quality of its decisions will degrade over time. So you have to keep maintaining your model and updating it. So that's a big part of it as well. So I hope I made the case that it's challenging. It's challenging to do.
Well, you raised a number of interesting issues here that I want to get into now with both of you, because we're testing a little bit the enforcer's premise about concentration and how it's affecting AI apps. So let me start with exploring a little bit about both of you, how you think about the state of competition in the AI app layer today. And I'm going to ask the same question about three different layers of the stack. So starting with the large language model, the foundation model layer, what effect does relative concentration at the LLM layer have on the state of competition in the app layer market? Elyse, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I think that's, again, really interesting question because it's both, I think, the level of concentration and also just like interest in kind of how companies are valuing what this might look like in the future. So kind of, when we think about how markets tend to evolve over time, right, there's a lot of natural expansion and contraction. And right now, we're certainly seeing a lot of interest and investment and expansion. So even though there might not be a ton of players in this part of the stack, we're still getting a lot of competition for now. And I think the challenge for enforcers is figuring out over time how to keep it that way and avoid, I think, I've heard the term, we've used the term in the antitrust world, tipping. At some point, when there becomes a market leader and everything just kind of floods to them, I think that's something that's really at the forefront of the agency's minds, particularly after seeing various developments throughout the history of the internet, including search engines, ads, online ads, social media, those kinds of things. I think that's kind of a big part of the focus right now is, it's concentrated but competitive right now. And how do we keep it competitive, particularly if it becomes the case that it becomes more concentrated at that level?
And Scott, if DeepSeek has introduced a new model that is open source, how do you respond to this question?
Yeah, so I think what happens is you need to make a distinction between the model itself and the way you get access to that model. So the model itself is the information that's been collected and organized in such a way that when I ask it a question, it answers in a certain way. The question, though, is where does that the processing happen for that model, and what infrastructure is that running in, and what does it cost to run that infrastructure? We'll get to cloud in a second, and I think when we talk about cloud, we can get more into what that means. So if you're looking at just the model, the question is, can I go get the model off of open source? DeepSeek's a good example. There are lots of other ones. Llama 3 from Meta, I mean, that's an open source model I can go get. I run that on my computer. I run a lot of models on my computer. So I can go download and just run models locally. They're not as fast, they're not as effective, they're not as big. You're not going to use it to run massive scale, but you can do things with them. So at the point that you're talking about the large companies and what's the impact of them, it's that I need to go to them if I'm going to run something at scale, and I want to get access to the best models for what I want to do. And keep in mind that what I said before about apples and it's not apples to apples. What I meant by that is maybe one model is really good at writing documentation, another one's really good at doing research, and another one's really good at processing audio. They don't all do the same things, and this is where the competition lies today. Is that if I go to an OpenAI or I go to a Google or Meta or some other company, I'm really looking at what features and functionalities around that foundational model they have do I want, in addition to what is this model good at? And we're still at that point. The question is, when this becomes more of a commodity and all the models do basically the same thing, where is the competition going to be? What's it going to look like? And I think it's going to be in the infrastructure more than the model itself at that point.
All right, so why don't we get to that? So same question, but with respect to cloud, what effect does relative concentration at the cloud layer have on the state of competition, the app layer market? Scott, let's start with you on this one.
Yeah, so I think I see positives and negatives. On the positive side, the cloud providers invest heavily in new technology and services that benefit the app developer. So as an app developer, what happens is they add more services and they all work together really well. They build that orchestration, if you will, that makes my life much easier. So it's much easier for me with a small team to build a fairly large scale app. I did this recently. We worked on a pretty large healthcare application and had a very small skeleton crew that built this very large application working in a regulated environment. Understand in healthcare, there's a lot of regulations, compliance issues that we have to think about along with the AI application issues. So the cloud provider provided me a lot of that infrastructure, made it really easy for me to work in. The problem we run into are a couple. One is when you don't have a lot of cloud options, you end up with cloud lock-in. And cloud lock-in is they provide you these features and services, but they work differently than their competitor. So all of a sudden, once you make a decision to go with one of them, you get stuck pretty easily if you don't design for a multi-cloud strategy. When you design for multi-cloud strategy, you're making these trade-offs where you're saying, I don't want to take advantage of everything you offer me because I may want to jump to a competitor. but there aren't that many competitors either. There's some major players, and then there's a next level down, and that's about it. So this brings to the negative, which is what I call the kill zone effect. They discourage innovation in certain areas as well. For instance, it is not unheard of that a cloud provider with these AI models will all of a sudden see that there's some vertical that's taking off, and they'll build their own version of it and compete with you. And this happens. And so all of a sudden they have huge competitive advantages over you when that happens as well. And I that feels almost unfair to me, but that's not unique to AI. That happens with all of these kind of, app stores and foundational tools like cloud.
Scott, that's interesting because it calls to mind some legislation we saw last Congress, which is very, very particular, but it involved enabling companies to move data from one cloud provider to another more easily and preventing cloud providers from communicating directly with users of their cloud services. So that's interesting. Elyse, same question to you with respect to cloud. And there's something interesting that Scott has been bringing up that I hadn't really considered here, which is he sees the model level as of the stack as differentiated, but cloud as maybe more commodified. So that's an interesting nuance. So I'd love to hear, Elyse, your thoughts on the question of cloud.
Yeah, I agree. That's a very interesting and insightful point from Scott. And I think another thing I kind of wanted to pull out of what Scott has been saying and, how I've been thinking about this. So, we're also have been talking about this as a stack, I think, which is common, but also when I think about it from a competition perspective, I think of it almost as more of a web, right? Because it's so much about collaboration and there's so many different factors at play, as Scott's been really helpfully detailing that, all of these decisions you have to make and how interdependent, especially at the app level, these decisions are. And I think that's a really big, should be a big focus for competition folks going forward, is really figuring out. So this is not just, like a traditional, let's say, steel or sugar monopoly, right? Where there's, kind of one decision maker and it's a clear through line. There's a lot of different factors and they all kind of have to work together to get the end product to work. So I kind of think about it as, how do we keep competition in, what's inherently in some ways a very collaborative environment. So I think it's really important to be thinking about how all of these different levels interact. And I think Scott raises a really good point in terms of, stickiness. If have gone with one cloud provider, there aren't a lot of them, especially, depending on how complex, I suppose, your app is and how much energy and resources it requires, you really don't have a ton of choices. And so that's certainly something that competition enforcers have been concerned about for a long time is, if you make a decision, are you stuck with this company? And then they can start taking advantage of that in ways that aren't beneficial for, the developers using them or for competition and consumers more broadly.
Elyse, let me start with you with the third part of that question. You talk about thinking about AI development as a web, but perhaps the most concentrated part of that web would be at the chip level. NVIDIA with its graphic processing units, by some measures, controls, it was seen as responsible for the development of AI, and by some measures control somewhere between 70 and 95% of the market. Yet, both of you, when DeepSeek came out, NVIDIA lost $600 billion off its market cap in one day. So what is the effect of concentration at the chip level on app layer? And then also, what effect do we think DeepSeek might have on that? Let's start with you.
Yeah. Super interesting, right? I think it's bounced back some. But again, I think, as we were talking about earlier, it's a little bit of an evolving issue at this point, right? Like how much that comes into play. And again, if, companies are actually able to significantly reduce costs and use fewer chips and materials, that might make a bigger difference going forward. But if they're still incredibly reliant on NVIDIA, and they're kind of the only ones in the space that, is a very different world. So I guess I'm really struggling right now to provide any more insights, just given how uncertain everything is.
So if you haven't already heard of this, it was funny. About a month or two ago, I wrote an article and I talked about this principle called the Jevons paradox. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but once this issue with DeepSeek happened and the NVIDIA stock dropped, it became what everyone in at least my community talked about. And so I kind of patted myself on the back that I wrote this before this all went down. So Jevons paradox basically, at a very simple level, says that as you make something more efficient, the demand goes up. An example would be if you fix the potholes in a road, in a bad road, you fix the potholes, more cars will now drive on it, right? And what that will do is lead to more maintenance needs. So that's kind of the nature of things. And there's lots of good examples of that throughout history. And so basically, this paradox affects the chip market too, in the sense that as soon as this happened and I saw that drop, and I didn't know yet whether DeepSeek was, the real deal or not. We all assume that it's amazing, which obviously would have an impact because you were saying, hey, it's a lot less expensive. You don't need as many chips. You don't need as expensive chips. That's pretty amazing. But the reality is all that really does is going to increase the demand for more chips. And so the demand is going to continue to go up. And it's a big problem because it can take a long time. If you're a small guy trying to get chips, it's hard. It's hard to get access. In the GPU market, NVIDIA, we talk about it's 90% of the market or whatever it is, it's high. And then you got TSMC is another big producer of advanced chips globally. But there aren't a lot of players. AMD has some work there. But what's starting to happen is some of the other vendors are starting to build their own chips. And so we'll see where that goes in the future. Maybe there'll be more competition. The problem is that NVIDIA has captured not just the chip market. They have an entire stack of software that works with that NVIDIA chip that has really locked in the market. It's more their software that is creating this barrier than just the physical hardware. And so it's going to be very hard to overcome that demand. Even when there's a lack of NVIDIA chips in the market, people still don't want to switch. So there's a lot of pull towards them, and this is going to be a tough thing to overcome. And why does this matter from the perspective of an app developer? Your performance is tied to your ability to run on fast parallel processing, which is what these GPUs are really good at, running lots of stuff at once rather than something linearly. And so you're beholden to the companies that have these things, and it does impact to some degree our ability to move forward.
And there's a long history of that in antitrust going back to IBM mainframes and the inability of companies to transition off of those. Let's turn to another issue that the enforcers have been looking at, which is steps that some of these companies are actively taking with respect to other layers of the stack. I'm talking about investments that companies like Amazon, Microsoft, and Google have been making in OpenAI, Anthropic, others in the LLM layer. Do you think these high-dollar investments will help kickstart the development of useful AI app layer tools, or will strings attached to these investments artificially prevent competition from doing what it's supposed to for consumers in these markets? Scott, let's start with you.
It's good and bad. I think that what we're going to find is that the accessibility to new innovations through those companies will accelerate, and that's great for the early adopter, the early application development where you're just testing stuff out. It could create barriers to competition in certain areas. Remember, I think what's happening is you're going to see more vertical applications. So the only concern I would have there, bigger concern right now, is if that investment goes into creating vertical solutions that then compete with me. My ability to have vertical expertise and data in a vertical and be able to compete that way by having better data for that particular vertical is where the business is going to be for a lot of these companies. And if they start buying those data sets and those applications and going into those fields, they could make it very difficult to compete.
Elyse?
Yeah, that's my sense of things as well. And again, from more of a competition history perspective, right? That if you have certain companies that incumbents that have certain interests they want to protect over time and they have the ability to do that, there are going to be concerns that they're guiding development in certain ways and excluding, to Scott's point, potential innovation from arising because they have their own goals and desires and they aren't necessarily aligned. And again, that's kind of why back to the web point, right, where it's just there's a lot of moving parts and interplay, and you have different incentives at different levels of the stack and different amounts of influence over the process. And I think that's again why the agencies have been so interested in this space and wanting to keep their thumb on the pulse to make sure that, competition is healthy and thriving and, that things like this aren't happening behind the scenes that are going to have, potentially really important unintended consequences in the long run.
Scott, do app developers have any kind of meaningful leverage in the opposite direction? Do they have any leverage with chip providers, cloud providers, data providers?
Some. So let's break it down a little bit. So cloud, I would say one thing is looking at a multi-cloud strategy. So by doing that, you are giving yourself a little bit of leverage in room. What it means is that you're designing your software in such a way that you're not necessarily taking advantage of the best that each cloud has to offer, but the commonality between them. So the things that they all do. And that if you can do that effectively, then you reduce your risk. And you can negotiate for whichever one has the best pricing and all of that. Volume pricing can help as you scale. You can do volume pricing. That may be helpful as well. There's not a ton. It's not like you're going to go build your own cloud infrastructure. So you are going to leverage one of them. There are also second tier clouds that are less expensive and more optimized for specific verticals or specific niches, and they will save you money as well. So there are more cost effective ways to get into a cloud infrastructure. In the chip area, unfortunately, not really, not today. There's really nothing you can do. Typically, you'll leverage an infrastructure that already has the chips. So, like, I'll go to AWS and I'll use their machines and their infrastructure, and so they're dealing with buying the chips, and I'm just renting them from them. So that's probably what I have to do, and I don't really have a lot of say at that level. And I think that's always been reality with computers. So I don't feel like that's a unique thing, but the demand is so high right now that it's a problem. And then in the data area, as I said, I think that there are some constraints on data. They talk about how public data is in the model. There's concentrated ownership of high quality training data by major tech companies. They're going to want to buy and own all of that data. And so what you can do is you can create proprietary data sets. So one way to do that is if you have a customer base already for some product or services, collecting data on that and using that to train your models. That gets in a whole other area of ethics and privacy and other issues that you need to deal with depending on your environment. The other reality is that, let me think about this. There's the quality of your data. See, this is the other thing. I said this early on. All data is not equal. Having lots of data doesn't make you better. And so a big company may have lots of data. They may not have high quality data that's very useful for training and having AI take action on. And so you can build higher quality data than they can. In fact, one of the early speculations around DeepSeek was they did a better job of training, was one of the things that people talked about. Maybe their data was higher quality that way. It's possible. I don't think that's what we're finding, but that could have been possible. So yes, there are definitely ways you can negotiate along the way, and differentiate. But I think what it's going to come down to is finding a vertical and having domain specific data sets in that vertical. That's how you're going to have to do it. I don't think it's going to be at the chip level that you're going to be able to negotiate.
All right. And now for the final lightning round, I'm going to ask you both two questions. A year from now, what will we be saying about DeepSeek? And a year from now, what will we be saying about competition at the app level? Elyse, let's start with you.
I think I've already disclosed in this conversation that I'm not really sure what to say today, even about either of those things. So we can speculate wildly, though. That sounds fun. I do think, we're going to learn a lot more about DeepSeek. We also didn't have time today to get into this, but there, have been a lot of national security concerns that are arising with that. So we'll have to see also how that plays out and how long-lived the DeepSeek intervention into this market is, I suppose. But I think, again, it's brought a lot of interesting challenges and I think spurred a lot of interesting conversations and hopefully some innovations in the market. And I'm sorry, I forgot the other lightning question.
A year from now, what will we be saying about app-level competition in AI?
App-level competition in AI. Yeah, hopefully a lot of really great things. I think it's a really exciting space. And as long as, again, we're doing what we need to keep competition happening at all of the other layers around it, I think there's just a lot of incredible things that are going to come from it. So hopefully we'll be saying it's, really vibrant and thriving and doing a lot to help people's lives.
Scott, the lightning bolt's pointing to you.
Okay, lightning bolt it is. The traditional view of AI requiring massive investment and resources being challenged by companies like DeepSeek. And I think that we're going to keep seeing these innovations that demonstrate that innovation can come from unexpected places. One of the things people need to understand about AI is that it's not a linear process where because we have this model today, the next model is going to obviously be X better and X faster. We don't know. We assume this. And so we're making a lot of assumptions that will get proven out over time. There's a good reason to assume this. But I'm also concerned at every level about the governance aspects of it. How well are we doing with dealing with things like bias and the ethical aspects of AI as well?
So what are the key takeaways here for practitioners? Scott, let's start with you.
The landscape is shifting. It's going to continue to move. We're going to have more focus on regulators looking at these killer collaborations of innovation. And I think that could be a good thing to look at. You need to strategically plan, and the key areas to monitor are going to be things like algorithmic collusion. We haven't talked about that as much, and companies need to balance innovation with ethical considerations.
And Elyse, the final word.
Yes, I agree with Scott. I think thoughtful kind of development throughout the web or the chain or the stack here, however we're referring to it, I think is going to be key. There's, as we've discussed, a ton of moving parts and things are moving quickly. And, having worked at the agencies, one thing they really value is just that you can show that you're thinking about these things as they're happening and trying to address issues as they come up. They don't expect you to be omnipotent or to be able to foresee everything that's going to happen. But they want to see that you are taking these issues, which are really serious, really seriously.
So thank you both. This has been a really informative discussion, as I think all of us are trying to understand not just the impact of artificial intelligence on our world, but also DeepSeek in particular. To our listeners, be sure to subscribe on your podcast platform of choice, and we'll see you next time on Trust and Trade.